July 3rd, 1954, monsoon rain over the hills near Chiang Rai. A patrol of the Royal Thai Army halts on a muddy track, and their column includes something that should not still exist. A squat, riveted light tank, its engine coughing diesel smoke into wet air, a chrysanthemum-shaped rivet pattern still faintly visible beneath repainted Thai insignia. 9 years after Japan surrendered, 9 years after its empire's armour rusted in jungles from Burma to the Philippines, this machine is still on active patrol, still hunting communist insurgents along a contested frontier. The soldier commanding it was a boy when the tank was built. Now he is trusting his life to a design Japan itself considered obsolete before the war even ended. This is not a story about one strange leftover machine. It is a story about how a small nation, squeezed between empires, learned to make permanence out of scarcity, and how a tank built for a war Thailand never wanted to fight became a tool for a war Thailand chose to fight on its own terms. To understand why the Type 95 Hago lingered so long in Thai service, you first have to understand what Thailand believed about survival in the 1930s, and why that belief was not naive. Part 1 is the belief. Thailand, then still called Siam, watched the 1930s the way a small country watches a house catching fire next door. With fear and with calculation, Japan was rearming, France held Indochina, Britain held Burma and Malaya. Siam had no illusions about defeating any of them in open war. What Siamese military planners believed, and what history had already taught them through decades of careful diplomacy, was that survival depended on never appearing weak enough to invade and never appearing strong enough to provoke. That meant modern equipment mattered less as a war-winning tool and more as a signal. We can bite back, so don't test us. By 1940, Siam had negotiated an arms deal with Japan for exactly this purpose. 60 Type 95 Hago tanks arrived, fast for their era at roughly 45 km per hour on road, armed with a 37mm gun, protected by armour never thicker than 12mm. Japanese planners themselves knew this armour was thin enough that a standard anti-tank rifle could punch through it at range. But Japan hadn't designed the Hago to slug it out with heavy armour. It was built for a different kind of war: fast, mobile, infantry support, colonial policing, jungle and rice paddy terrain, where roads were poor and speed mattered more than steel. That single design philosophy, light, fast, cheap to produce, easy to ship, would matter enormously later, though nobody in 1940 could have predicted why. Siam's own generals believed something reasonable too, that armour, any armour, was a multiplier against an enemy without armour. And for the war Siam actually fought next, that belief turned out to be correct. In late 1940 and early 1941, Siam fought France over disputed Indochinese border territory. Thai Hago tanks saw action at Aranya Prathet and around the Mekong frontier. French colonial forces, thinly equipped, had almost no armour of their own. Against that specific opponent, in that specific terrain, the Hago's thin armour was irrelevant. Its speed and firepower were not. Siam won the exchange, gained territory, and walked away with a lesson that would shape the next 14 years of decision-making. This tank works for us, in our wars, on our terrain. Then came December 1941, and everything changed at once. Part 2 is the hidden answer, and it isn't really hidden. It's structural, and it explains why a supposedly obsolete tank kept fighting long after the empire that built it collapsed. When Japan invaded Thailand in December 1941, as a stepping stone toward Malaya and Burma, Thai forces resisted only briefly before the government, under Plek Phibunsongkhram, negotiated an alliance rather than an occupation. Thailand became a nominal partner of Japan, not a conquered territory. That distinction mattered more than almost anyone realised at the time. Because Thailand was an ally, not a colony, its military hardware was never absorbed into Japanese logistics chains the way equipment in occupied Malaya or the Philippines was cannibalised, requisitioned, or destroyed in the retreat. Thai Hago tanks stayed Thai property throughout the war. They were maintained by Thai crews in Thai depots, using whatever parts and improvisation Thai mechanics could manage. When Japan collapsed in August 1945, Thailand did not lose an occupying army's equipment, it simply kept what it already owned. That is the overlooked mechanism behind this story. Survival of the Type 95 in Thai service was not really about the tank at all. It was about political positioning. Thailand's wartime manoeuvring kept its arsenal intact, while empires around it were stripped bare. Part 3 goes deeper into the machine behind the outcome, because owning 60 tanks in 1945 and still fielding dozens of them in 1954 are two very different achievements. The real story here is logistics and improvisation under isolation. After the war, Thailand faced an arms embargo climate. The victorious allies were wary of a nation that had allied with Japan, however reluctantly. New tank purchases from Western suppliers were not simple to arrange in the immediate post-war years, and Thailand's economy, like most of Southeast Asia's, was in no position for rapid rearmament. So Thai army workshops did something unglamorous but decisive. They kept the Hagos running through sheer mechanical stubbornness. Spare parts became a national puzzle. Thai depot crews cannibalized non-operational hulls to keep others moving, a practice that, by the early 1950s, had already reduced the original 60-tank purchase toward the smaller operational figure of roughly 48 that remained recognized as active service vehicles. Engines were rebuilt using locally machined components when Japanese originals failed. Tracks were relayed by hand. This was not high strategy. It was workshop floor persistence, the kind of unglamorous engineering culture that rarely gets filmed but always decides whether old equipment survives or becomes scrap. And crucially, Thailand had a use for these tanks that made the effort worthwhile. A slow-burning insurgency along its northern and northeastern borders, where communist guerrilla activity was rising through the late 1940s and into the 1950s as the wider Indochina conflict spilled outward. For this kind of fight, patrol actions, road security, support for infantry sweeps through hill country, the Hago's original design philosophy suddenly became relevant again. It didn't need to survive a modern anti-tank gun. It needed to move on bad roads, intimidate lightly armed insurgents, and keep running without a sophisticated supply chain behind it. The very qualities that made it obsolete against a first-rate army made it sufficient against an insurgency. Part 4 is the collision with reality, and it plays out not in one dramatic battle, but across a slow, grinding decade of patrol duty that historians of conventional warfare tend to skip past entirely. Picture a Thai armoured patrol moving out from a provincial garrison in the early 1950s. 3 or 4 Hagos, some open-top Japanese trucks, infantry riding on the tank decks because there is no other transport. The column pushes into hill country where roads dissolve into cart tracks after rain. This is where the tank's low weight, barely 7.5 tons, becomes an asset rather than a weakness. Heavier Western tanks bog down or can't cross the same bridges. The Hago, built originally for exactly this kind of terrain, in China and Southeast Asia, simply keeps moving. The insurgents rarely stood and fought armour directly. They had little to fight it with. The tank's role was less about destroying enemy formations and more about presence, reconnaissance, and the psychological weight of showing up at all. When contact happened, the 37mm gun and turret machine gun were more than sufficient against lightly armed guerrilla bands. The danger to the crews came less from enemy fire and more from mechanical failure in remote terrain, ambush on narrow roads, and the accumulating fatigue of running Depression-era engineering with 1950s wear and tear. By 1954, Thai Army records placed the operational Type 95 fleet at roughly 48 tanks, a number worn down from the original 60 by 9 years of hard use, cannibalization, and the simple attrition of age, yet still a real, functioning force conducting real operations. Some crews had trained on these machines as young men in the 1940s and were now training the next generation of Thai tank crews on the same hulls, an unbroken chain of institutional knowledge that Western armies, constantly re-equipping with new models, rarely built around a single piece of hardware. This is where the story's deeper meaning starts to surface. The Type 95's Thai service life was not an accident of neglect. It was the result of an institution, the Royal Thai Army's Maintenance Corps, treating old equipment not as junk to be replaced, but as a resource to be sustained through skill. In an era when major powers measured strength by how quickly they could field new armour, Thailand measured it by how long it could keep old armour useful. That is a genuinely different philosophy of military power. And it worked for exactly the kind of war Thailand actually needed to fight. Part 5 is the verdict, and it requires being honest about what this story is and isn't. This is not a tale of an unstoppable weapon or a hidden super weapon nobody saw coming. The Type 95, Hago, was, by any conventional measure, a mediocre tank even in 1940, thin-skinned, lightly armed by the standards of the tanks that would dominate the deserts of North Africa or the plains of Eastern Europe within a few years of its debut. Against a modern, mechanized army, it would have been destroyed in an afternoon. That was never in question. What kept it running for 14 years after its manufacturer's empire collapsed was something else entirely. The alignment between a weapon's original design purpose and the specific, unglamorous war Thailand actually needed to fight. Lightweight and mechanical simplicity, originally chosen for Japanese colonial expansion, turned out to be exactly the qualities needed for counter-insurgency patrol duty on bad roads in hill country. Political manoeuvring during the war, which kept Thailand nominally allied rather than occupied, preserved the hardware base intact when the war ended. And post-war economic necessity, combined with a maintenance culture that treated cannibalization and hand-machined parts as a point of professional pride rather than a shameful compromise, stretched that hardware base across a decade and a half of continuous service. By the mid-1950s, newer equipment, American-supplied Stuarts and eventually Shermans, arriving as Thailand aligned itself firmly with the United States during the early Cold War, finally began replacing the Hago fleet in frontline roles. The remaining tanks were phased into training duties, static defence, and eventually museum storage, their combat service quietly ending not with a dramatic defeat, but with simple technological succession. What deserves remembering is not the tank itself, but the men who kept it alive past any reasonable expectation of usefulness, the depot mechanics machining replacement, parts from memory and improvisation, the crews who trusted decade-old Japanese engineering on monsoon roads because no better alternative was available, and the quiet institutional decision, made without fanfare, that a poor nation's security could be built on maintenance and ingenuity rather than constant acquisition. Those 48 tanks patrolling Thai hill country in 1954 were not a relic of Japanese power. They were a monument to Thai persistence, proof that in the right hands, and for the right war, obsolescence is not a fixed condition. It is simply a judgment waiting to be proven wrong by necessity.